So in terms of everything, guys, I want to talk about improving those muscle gains, how to adjust your macros and your workouts and everything. So in terms of the actual rate of muscle gains that you can expect, the stinky part about it is the longer you have been working at it, the more advanced a trainee you are, the more you have worked out your entire life, the slower results are going to happen. Often if we've been really out for injury or someone's starting out for the first time, that's why we actually had a joke going in the Wranglers communication where we were talking about how men ages 18 to 24, when they have newbie lifter gains, always see great dramatic results and everything always works for them because they're newbies, and it makes it a lot easier, and they also are peak time in that age range to gain muscle. But anyway, there is no fast fix. You can't rush results like we can rush weight loss on the scale. Is it truly fat loss? No, but we can, deplete glycogen stores. We can lose water weight to make the scale change faster in terms of losing weight. Again, not real fat loss, but you can't even do anything to make muscle seem to appear faster, because you can gain more weight on the scale, but logically you also know that's fat. Okay. The faster you do try and gain muscle as well, often the more fat you put on, which usually when we're trying to gain muscle, we still want the same body comp. Okay. So 1% to 2% body recomposition in a month is freaking stellar, which feels like usually like 1 pound. Okay. And in terms of the different rates of gain, there are actually two main researchers who've delved into this and delved into it. And there are the different breakdowns here that I can sort of go over. But as you can see, the more advanced you are, the slower the changes are going to happen. Like McDonald, you see 2 to 3 pounds a year. Okay, right? 0.25 to 0.5% total body weight per month. This changes are going to be slower the more advanced you are. And I bring this up because I think it can be really frustrating when you're like, but I'm not new to this, I've been doing this a while, and you think that should actually help you. And in the long run, it actually holds you back just because your body is adjusted to a lot of the volume that you've done. It's adjusted to the types of moves that you've done. It often takes a little bit more meticulousness in tracking macros, even because you don't necessarily, especially if you are leaner, don't have the fat stores to use, right? So it's one of these things that if you, don't get the right surplus, you can end up actually cannibalizing muscle tissue as you're trying to build it. So there's a lot of nuance to this, guys, but I wanted to highlight the fact that we have to expect results to be slow. The more we want to even lose body fat or keep the fat off as we gain muscle, the slower the results are going to get. And that's really the way to do it. You'll see all these bodybuilders. I don't know if you guys have ever sort of looked at some of that stuff. They'll be like eating all this pizza and doing all this different stuff. And it's like these different like bulks that they'll do where they have a whole bunch of horrible, bad for them food. And it's one of these things that then they end up gaining a ton of fat. But they also know what it takes to eventually cut all that fat off. So they know the pain that is associated with that. And so they're willing to do it. But in that process of also cutting fat, a lot of times they lose muscle. So here they might have put on 10 pounds of muscle, but then in the process of cutting off fat, they want to put on all that 10 pounds. So it's probably better to go a little bit slower and ultimately just keep the fat off, especially if you aren't doing that for a competition where you're willing to be really, really miserable for multiple months too. I don't recommend doing the bodybuilder way. So basically you want to think slow gains are the best gains. So I want to talk about both the macro side of things and the workout side of things. When we talk about weight loss, it's really popular to say that like diet is like 90% of the battle, 80% of the battle, basically most of the battle, right? And it is true that you can lose weight, lose fat, basically without working out, just by changing your diet. However, that is not quite the case when it comes to gaining muscle, because you need to create that progression, that overload for muscles to have to rebuild and adapt. Okay. So the macro side is really, really key for both keeping the fat off and for actually aiding in those muscle gains. Because a lot of times what happens is we're training really hard, we're doing more in the gym, we're trying to lift heavier, but we're not actually giving our muscles the fuel they need to build and repair. Okay. So if you're going for muscle gains, you got to stop fearing the carbs. And you got to focus on protein, right? Protein is the building blocks of muscle. If we get ourselves enough protein, we're going to give our body what it needs to repair and rebuild so that it actually doesn't try and break down and get amino acids from our own muscle tissue, right? That's the really weird thing that can happen, right? If we're eating too low a calorie, if we don't have the readily available energy, our body will actually break down its own muscle tissue to get the amino acids it needs to then rebuild, which basically is sort of a point of diminishing returns, working hard to not get anywhere, right? Because we're just taking from our own muscle tissue. So it's one of these things that you need to focus on actually gaining lean muscle by fueling properly. let's see if I can actually let these people in too. As I do this, try and multitask, my brain doesn't do that very well. But anyway, you want to focus on carbs and protein. So protein, you want to make sure that you're getting the amino acids you need so your muscles can actually repair and rebuild. Carbs are about that immediately available energy to spare your protein or to spare your muscle tissue so you don't draw on it for protein, okay? It also is about getting the energy that you need to create that anabolic environment. So it's not only hormone levels, but actually that readily available energy so you can push hard during your workouts. Because I think what we often forget is like, if you're dieting down, right, especially when you're starting to cut your calories, there are going to be dips in your energy. And while we might be pushing at 100% intensity in our workouts based on the energy we have, that 100% isn't our true 100%. So when we're trying to really tear down muscle tissue, so to speak, so that it can repair and rebuild stronger, we want to be training as close to the actual accurate 100% as we can, which means having that readily available energy, okay? So we want to think, are we getting the carbs right prior to our workouts so we have, that immediate fuel? Or if we really do prefer to train fasted, which is something that we might want to discuss if muscle gaining is your primary focus, you might want to make sure that you're timing more carbs later at night so that you're not completely depleted when you wake up in the morning. But you want to make sure that you have fuller glycogen stores. You want to make sure that you're also focusing on protein. And then based on the ratios you respond to. So here's the nuance in it. If you find that, hey, I really don't feel good on higher carb ratios, I feel much better on lower carb ratios, we can even play around with the exact meal timing to make sure that the carbs are timed around your workouts so that you're still getting the benefit. So there are going to still be variations in the ratios you use based on your needs and goals, but it's one of those things that you got to stop during carbs and you got to focus on the protein. As we're also working on those muscle gains, you might find that you stay on certain macro ratios a little bit longer as you're building because you want that consistency in fuel. And you want that consistency in fuel to make sure that your energy isn't sort of adjusting or like fluctuating on you a ton because you want to be able to push in your workouts, okay? So again, stop during carbs, focus on that protein. If we find that, lower carb ratios in general do make you feel better, you have health concerns, whatever, we might adjust first with that meal timing. This is not necessarily the time you want to introduce intermittent fasting. Now, in terms of the surplus, so how many calories you actually need, this is where you see those bodybuilding, like dirty bulks where people are going crazy with the calorie surplus. They're not eating necessarily quality foods. That's why they gain a ton of fat. I don't personally want to gain a ton of fat, even when I gain muscle, because again, even when you gain more muscle potentially with the other, you then end up cutting and then don't really keep it all on. So then you're doing extra work both places. I'm lazy. Okay. So you want to think 100 to 400 calories surplus. And that really depends on what other things you're doing. How much cardio are you including? How much training are you doing? What is your metabolic rate? How much muscle mass do you have on? How hard a gainer are you? How much of a newbie lifter are you? Newbie lifters can potentially get away with very small surplus and see great results. If we have more body fat on, aka we're not as lean as we'd like to be, we can maybe do a smaller surplus or even get away with a slight deficit. The leaner that we are, the more we might have to go with a bigger deficit or a bigger surplus to gain, okay? But don't go crazy with it, be consistent, especially if you have been on a weight loss journey previously and you've just finally reached the point where you actually are at the aesthetic that you want in terms of your leanness level. Even think about just going up to maintenance and not a surplus over your maintenance. So you just first want to even come out of that deficit before you even think about going to a surplus. You don't want to do a dramatic change because the thing is we haven't necessarily created that set point. If you just lost, your body still will have the tendency to want to regain the fat just because you haven't necessarily created that new set point. Your body hasn't adjusted and adapted. So you even want to give yourself a little time in that maintenance level, maybe even going to different ratios where you maybe have more carbs while you're still in that slight deficit or very small increases in your calories, okay? On top of going back to the fact that you don't want to do the dirty bulk because you gain fat and all that other things, they're generally not as healthy for us and they actually don't make us feel as good. I don't know if you guys have ever tried training after like a cheat day or a day where you didn't necessarily have the quality fuel that you usually have. You kind of feel a little lethargic in your workout. You kind of feel bloated, don't feel as good. You can't push as hard. So on top of the fact that we want those quality foods, even if we can work in more fun foods, when we go into that surplus, we do want it for the micronutrient benefits. Our body is an engine, right? We want to give it the fuel that it actually needs to run efficiently and effectively. It won't run as well if we don't put in the right fuel, okay? So do consider those micronutrients. It will really help you actually feel better to get more out of your workouts to build that lean muscle. It's a more efficient system when we give it what it needs, okay? And then depending on what your training looks like, depending on your age, because guys, as we get older, and part of the reason I bring this up is because people will be like, oh, I can't gain muscle, I'm getting older, or I can't gain muscle, I'm going through menopause. That is false. You can gain muscle through both periods. How you approach it is just different. It's why dialing those macros is so key. But based on even, your age and all those different things, there might be supplements that you want to add in to really help push you over that sort of plateau, especially if you're an advanced lifter. If you've been training for a really long time, guys, and you're really experienced and your body is probably adjusted to a lot of the things you've thrown at it, you need to then go into that 1% to really dial everything in to make sure you're using every tool in your toolbox to get results, okay? So this is where we might want to talk about BCAAs even during your workouts, use of creatine, especially if you are a plant-based eater or you don't eat much red meat, and then even protein powder, just because how you time these things can even impact, how quickly you're getting your muscles the fuel that you actually need. And while if you don't eat right away, you're not going to lose all your muscle mass. If we're going for pure muscle gains and we're lean already, or you're lean already, you need to make sure that you're actually trying to use those optimized times, and you're going to potentially want to dive into some of these different supplements. I'm not going to go into this a ton. Michelle's actually going to do a great video on using supplements and stuff, and we can go into specific supplements more. But this is just more about really optimizing everything in your programming and really thinking, where is there opportunity where I'm not doing something? Then I wanted to talk about adjusting your workouts, okay? So obviously for gaining muscle, strength training is key. Cardio, on the other hand, is not as ideal. Now, if you are an endurance athlete, I am not telling you that you have to stop doing everything that you're doing, but I will tell you that it is going to make the process more challenging, and that we potentially will want to try and use a time where your mileage doesn't have to be as high, where you're not necessarily training for a race, where we can even get you out of as much steady state cardio and into maybe a little bit more interval type work. But cardio is going to work against the muscle gaining process. So this is not the time to add in more cardio. Now with strength training, weights are very, very helpful to the process of building muscle. However, that is not the only way to create progression. The simple fact of the matter is, if it challenges you, it will change you, okay? We do want to use weights as often as possible, just because it makes it very, very simple to create that progression. But if you're training with body weight, we can advance movements through doing unilateral moves, different ranges of motion, different tempos, different time under tension, even the volume that we play with and the training frequency that we create over the week can all help you build muscle. So you are not doomed if you cannot lift weights. Even if you can lift weights, we still want to make sure that we're working through a variety of rep ranges. We want to do lower reps and heavier weights with compound movements, and then we might want to do higher reps and slightly lower weights for isolation moves. I don't like saying light or heavy fully, because every weight should always challenge you for the rep range that you do. But by the nature of fewer reps or more reps, you're going to have a weight that will challenge you for those rep ranges so you can actually complete them. But we want to think about a diversity of rep ranges. Often that hypertrophy rep range is what people turn to, which is about 6 to 12 reps. But the problem with only staying in that is that if you never challenge your maximal strength, right, you can't necessarily lift more during that. If you never do some of the more strength endurance, you're also not building out your capacity for work. You're also not potentially fatiguing muscles fully or calling on as many muscle fibers as possible. So by working through all different rep ranges, even with different types of movement, we can really get the full benefit. Because we also have to remember that there's 3 drivers of muscle growth. So there's muscle tissue damage, mechanical tension, and metabolic stress. For an example of this, thinking about the glutes, okay? If you do squats, those are going to cause muscle tissue damage. They're putting the most load on the muscle when the muscle is stretched. They have a bigger range of motion, a bigger eccentric component, okay? Versus mechanical tension would be something like the hip thruster, where there's a slightly smaller range of motion, less on the eccentric, still eccentric, but less. And there's actually more load on the muscle when it is strongest. So if you think about it, at the top where your glutes are engaged, that's where the load is the load is the heaviest on the muscle, versus in the squat at the bottom where the glutes are actually stretched is where the load is heaviest on the muscle, okay? The last one, metabolic stress, is those pumper-based movements. So it's things like the glute activation, things that really pump and burn, okay? That is sort of going back to blood flow restriction a little bit. It's usually smaller range of motion. There's consistent tension on the muscle. There's a lot more tension on the muscle where it's contracted the most, okay? But you want to use all different 3 drivers of muscle growth. We don't want to just focus on making ourselves sore. Actually, they've shown that potentially just focusing on muscle tissue damage and making yourself sore isn't even as good, because you can't increase the training frequency as much. You're constantly breaking down muscle tissue. So you want to make sure that you're using all 3 to really improve your capacity for work, be able to lift more, and therefore actually improve your muscle gains. And you might work in different rep range, using higher reps for the pumper-based movements and lower reps for those compound maximal strength type movements, okay? The other thing I want to point out in the workouts is, while cardio can be catabolic, Too often we even change our strength training sessions into cardio sessions. We do the metabolic strength, which I think is super freaking valuable when we're short on time, and especially when we want to achieve fat loss while retaining muscle. However, if we're going for pure muscle gains, creating more metabolic strength workouts is going to work against us. So often we eliminate rest from things to make workouts feel harder, to consolidate because we're short on time. But especially if we want to actually build maximal strength, if we want to build muscle, we need to make sure that we're including an appropriate amount of rest. Because as much as you feel like you might be able to give 100% the next round, if you don't give yourself a certain amount of time, you're not, okay? You want to think, if there is longer rest design in your workouts, how can I feel like I deserve that rest? How can I feel like I've earned that rest? When I lift in that 1 to 5 rep max range, like doing deadlift, holy moly, I don't want to lift that weight for 3 to 5 minutes. I want that whole rest period, right? That's not a long time. It doesn't feel like a long time because of how heavy the weight is. So you want to think, how can I make myself earn the rest? When you're working that 1 to 5 rep range, you're going to think 3 to 5 minutes potentially between rounds of an exercise. If you're doing, supersets, trisets, whatever, even single movements in that mark hypertrophy rep range, it might be more in the, 1 minute, 90 seconds to 2 minutes type rest range. If you're doing more of the strength endurance, it's probably going to be 60, maybe pushing 45 seconds to 90 seconds of rest for those higher rep ranges. But do not cut back on the rest. You're not trying to make your workouts more cardio. You're trying to actually give your body a chance to recover so you have full energy stores to try and go back and lift as heavy as possible each and every round, because again, you're trying to drive that muscle growth through having to force the muscles to be overloaded and then have to rebuild and repair, okay? On top of that, when you're designing your workout progression, first things first, you always focus on the schedule that's realistic for you. Don't try and force 6 days a week if 3 days are realistic, because you're not going to be consistent. You're not going to get the results, because if we try and do 6 days and then we get 3 of those workouts in, that's not designed for that, right? So it's not going to get you the full benefit. You can design full body split for 3 days a week. You might do body part or hemisphere or whatever if you're doing 6, but you want to design for the time you actually have. So that's first and foremost the point. But even with 3 days, you can play around with the training frequency. You could do upper, lower, like full body, right? Then you're only hitting areas twice a week, versus you could do full body all 3 times and hit that all the areas 3 times a week. So it's one of these things that you can still change for training frequency even based on the schedule that you have. So don't worry if you only have 3 days or you have 6, you can make it work. But you do want to play around with that training frequency, especially for stubborn areas. You want to think about training them more frequently over the week. You have to be conscious of the volume you're creating. So how many reps and sets and movements you're doing for an area over the course of the week, because too much will reach a point of diminishing returns. But you want to think maybe doing a little bit less each workout and increasing that training frequency over the week, especially for stubborn areas, can be very, very helpful. Even adding in finishers, if you see burners in your workout, a lot of times those are even added strategically to increase training frequency for an area without necessarily creating a ton of muscle tissue damage, making you really sore, or doing things that will end up overloading or reaching that point of diminishing returns. But we might want to increase the training frequency for those areas, adding in burners or isolation burners for specific stubborn muscle groups, just to even fatigue more muscle fibers that workout or during the week, okay? In terms of using volume to your advantage, it goes the same thing. There is a point of diminishing returns where we're just doing too much volume and it's wasted volume because we're not actually able to push hard. But we also want to push that training density at time. It's why you might have those sets where they're actually timed to increase that training density, so the volume of work that you can do in a set amount of time. It's why we might actually, if you're training with body weight, increase the reps that you're doing, increase the training frequency over the work to increase the volume because you don't have the loads. So you want to think that volume is not necessarily bad, but just trying to do more reps for the sake of doing more reps will backfire, okay? That's why we want to potentially, again, go back to increasing the training frequency, so how often we're actually working muscles over the week, which is really funny because a lot of those bodybuilder like workout programs go back to actually, especially old school ones, go back to like just body part workouts. But that came into play, I think, a lot of times with the rise of the traditional gym, where it's really hard to actually go from one piece of equipment to another instead of doing supersets or whatnot. And so they would do that. But you see a lot of stuff with even like Arnold and them doing a lot of like training frequency over the week for different areas, not necessarily body part splits. You see a lot of research coming out now for bodybuilders, especially doing more full body splits. So do think, okay, how can I work in that training frequency? Not always only creating muscle tissue damage, aka not just trying to squat or lift heavier, make myself sore, but even using the activation type movements or the pumper based movements to not make yourself so sore that you change your activation for future workouts, but you can keep training hard and get in a little bit more work for areas. So I'm actually going to stop sharing this. I will put that slideshow up. I could not see if anybody asked any questions, so I apologize. But Any questions or comments or concerns with any of that, guys? I know that was a lot of info all at once, but hopefully it was helpful. And hopefully that will actually show up in the replay, because I realized I forgot to spotlight my screen. So hopefully it's not just a random gray square. If it is, I will definitely put the slideshow in there so you guys can all see that too. Okie dokie. Well, instead of staring at all of you awkwardly, I will let all of you go. If you do think of any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out, guys. Just remember that gaining muscle is a slow process. And I bring this up not to demotivate you, but actually to make you embrace that it will be a slow process and make you realize that nothing is wrong with you if it is a slow process. When is it better to have carbs before or after the workout? Depends, could be both. Okay, so like there will be people that train fasted because of the timing in the morning, but you need potentially carbs both times, because if you've, working out in the morning and you went to bed and you slept whatever amount of time and you had a meal earlier, your glycogen stores could be a little bit depleted. So you might find that you need some carbs prior to your workout, but you might find that it feels really bad, so that you only want to get them after, so that you replenish those glycogen stores, you help yourself rebuild. But you do want to think that you have full glycogen stores as much as possible, especially if you are a more advanced lifter. If you've really struggled with those gains, then you want them as much around it as possible, just so you have all of that energy right there to be used. But again, it's going to be still individual, which is always the sucky answer to everything.
Yeah, I also have a question about the drinking protein shakes. Do you drink it before the workout, an hour before, or do you drink it an hour after the workout?
So again, it depends. You don't need to use protein shakes at all. I'm just going to put that out there. You can get protein from other sources, but you usually want to get it as close to post session as possible. That's ideal. If you do take it before, it's not as urgent to take it right after. But again, it depends on whether or not you are training fasted, how you feel when your last meal was the night before. But especially post-workout, you want to try and get it as close to the workout as possible, but your muscles aren't going to melt off if you don't. And how much it's essential that you use these post-exercise windows will depend on your age, whether or not you're going through menopause, whether or not you're super lean already, right? Because if we have more fat on, it's not as urgent as if we're lean, where there's more risk of you catalyzed muscle tissue. And again, as we get older, it's harder or we're less able to utilize protein as efficiently. So it's even more key that we get it when we need. And potentially, even instead of just 1 scoop of protein or only 24 grams, we want to think, can we get 40 post-workout? But you wouldn't need 40 post-workout if you took 1 prior and after. So there's so much option or opportunity in it, but you do want to try and time it as closely around your workouts as possible, so you have those amino acids available. But if you even use like BCAAs during, or start drinking them right before and then during, and then take your protein after, that could be another way to get it as well. So it also depends on how you like to fuel.
I have a question. As a 62-year-old, and now I got a new job. I've been working on Amtrak, but I just moved to LA. And so I work 18 hours a day, 3 days, 4 days a week. And then, so I might have 2 days to work out. And eating on the train is another story. So I'm going to try to bring all my protein. But what's the best way for my abs? Should I be doing planks at least? It's funny because I can't work out every day when I want to, because we're on the train just too long. So I want to maximize the 2 days I do have. So I just want to know what you think would be the best way. And, for the belly fat.
Not exercise. For fat loss, you got to focus on the macros and get consistent. There's no way to out-train to lose belly fat. So we can optimize potentially, especially once you get down to the last little bit in areas, we can have you do like a core burner and then go for a walk or do something slightly cardio afterwards to sort of utilize the mobilized fatty acids, because when you work a muscle group, there are more fatty acids to mobilize from the surrounding tissues. So we can use that, but I will tell you that for fat loss, it is 100% going to come back to macros. We can have you not train at all and see amazing fat loss results, especially if we dial in your macros correctly so that you can lose that stubborn belly fat. But there's just simply not as much blood flow to that area. And there's a different type of fat cell in the stubborn areas, which actually does make it more stubborn, which really is annoying. But it just means that we're going to see fat even come off of other areas before we see it come off of that. So we can't necessarily preferentially use fat from those areas. Again, though, we can add in or discuss like with those 2 days a week, how you can use a little core burner at the end and then maybe go for a walk or whatever after to utilize more of the mobilized fatty acids. But still, yeah.
Yeah, wondered because I don't understand the macros yet, but I guess I'm just gonna bring as much protein as I can and throw it in when I can. And
It's
then,
small changes. Yep. It's small changes focusing on hitting those ratios, increasing the protein, and we'll guide you through. So please don't worry about that. But it is one of those things that you will just want to focus on that protein, focus on hitting those macro ratios and that consistency, and that is going to really help.
yeah, and we walk a lot. That is one thing I do on the train is walk.
That's awesome. Do you have a recommended BCAAs? When I take mine, it makes me feel very lightheaded during the workout. Well, I prefer my brand, but I'm completely biased to that because I think they taste fabulous. So I made them to my liking. I would definitely say we want to assess why that is, and if there is something in the way that the amino acids are affecting potentially even like with protein, guys, there's like the thermic effect of it. So if that has something to do with it, or if there's something else in how you're timing stuff or being lack of fueling, is I would be curious with some of that, but we can dive into that. But there's more specifics, or potentially if there's something in it with like a sweetener that you don't like or whatnot. But it would be what you also respond to.
Yeah, I think it might be, sorry, Corey, I was just gonna add on a little bit. I
Mhm.
typically work out during my fast, so my intermittent fast. And so it maybe it's breaking my fast. And so then it's not enough. I don't know.
It shouldn't break your fast. I mean, unless it has calories. Most of the ones that don't have calories, like BCAAs actually became more popular because they were something that people could take during their fast to not break their fast, but still make sure that they're protecting their lean muscle. So I would actually say we even look at what your last meal timing is a little bit more, and even the breakdown of that to see if that can impact it, because maybe you're just low energy because you're like in a deficit, like not necessarily having the readily available fuel. So it's kind of like we're assuming causation when there's not really any.
I'm laughing because Kristen is on the call and she would totally agree with you. She would totally agree that you're under eater.
Yeah, so that's it. You're assuming causation where there isn't any. That happens a lot. Don't worry, you're not the only one. But so we do want to get you potentially timing a little bit more food later at night, just so that you actually have that energy, because yeah, that's key.
Awesome, thanks.
Under eating is not good, but that's another subject for another day. Is there a protein source besides powder that you recommend, or is this discussed another? There's lots of protein sources I recommend. I mean, from shrimp to cottage cheese to Greek yogurt to tofu to tempeh, there's a ton of them. If you're talking about timing right around your workouts, guys, you always want to focus on protein sources that are leaner, because fat will slow the digestion and absorption, and you want to have it be as immediate as possible. Any thoughts on fish oil? Is that BCAAs? I don't know what that is. BCAAs are branched chain amino acids. So there's some essential amino acids. Usually they focus more on leucine, just because that really helps with building muscle, especially as we go through menopause, and especially for all my females out there, it's really, really helpful. Fish oil is different. Fish oil is fish oil. It is an anti-inflammatory. I actually don't like using fish oil unless I really need to for a client for inflammation reasons, because an inflammatory response from your workouts, guys, is actually good, right? We are causing inflammation. It's why I actually don't like people taking any sort of like anti-inflammatory, like pain medication, if possible, when they're trying to gain muscle, because while yes, you are sore, it can actually impair your recovery from it. I'm not saying if you don't have a headache or something not to use it, but I would say as much as possible, don't try and use those things for recovery, just to not be sore. For health reasons, for inflammation reasons, that's okay, but I don't like using those things for aiding in recovery with workouts. Just wondering why BCAAs versus EAs. They're fine. EAs are fine. I don't find I necessarily need that. And for me, it's just all about getting that leucine for people. Branch chains are really easy. Either one really can work. It depends on how much you need that complete amino acid chain. I just need the little bump because I'm also getting enough protein from other places, and usually encouraging clients to get enough protein from other places to hit the ratios anyway. So it makes it easy. Cool. Great questions, guys. Hopefully this was helpful. Have a great Thursday and a great rest of your week. Bye.